Charlie. And I just want to say what a compliment is to Ari, that when he can't make it, he gets the director of education at Park Avenue Synagogue. For those of you that don't know New York Jewish politics, Park Avenue Synagogue is a little bit like the Vatican. So we have the Archbishop himself with us, and I'm very grateful, Charlie. I want to talk tonight about two texts, and one of the texts is going to directly address a question that I've gotten now repeatedly from people who have been on the call and on the last 2 weeks. But before I start looking at text, and Charlie will share the screen and put up the text for us, I also want to acknowledge my longtime friend, ever young Esther Dosick. I've known Esther since I was a teenager in United Synagogue Youth in Chicago. And I'm going to say it again, Chicago. So Esther can shep nachas from the old accent. And Esther, I'm always just delighted to see you. And when Andy joins us to see Andy on the screen, it's just wonderful because I feel like I'm with family. I want to start with one of the ancient texts of rabbinic literature. It's from the Mishnah. I mentioned this last time, but I'll mention it again because it bears mentioning more than once. The Mishnah is the central text of rabbinic Judaism. It was edited orally around the year 200 of the Common Era, and it's divided up into 6 orders, each order being roughly akin to a social anthropological notion. Mary Douglas, the great social anthropologist, once described that when she goes out to investigate a primitive tribe, she looks at the following things. She wants to know what their agriculture looks like. She wants to know what their calendar looks like. Assuming it's patriarchal, she wants to know how they treat women. In her plummy British accent, she would say, do they have courts and torts? Then she would ask about totem and taboo. What are their sacred things? Who are their shamans? And what is pure and what is impure? And once, gosh, many years ago, 45 years ago, Mary Douglas gave a lecture at JTS. And when she finished talking about those 6 categories, the late Jacob Neusner, may he rest in peace, stood up and said, Elu Shisha Sidre Mishnah. These are, in fact, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is divided into these social anthropological categories, and it goes through first agriculture and all the different laws of agriculture we find in the Torah. Then it goes through the Jewish holidays. So for instance, now we would be studying to prepare, we'd be reading Rosh Hashanah. And once that was over, Yom Kippur, and there's a tractate on Sukkot, etc. But the Mishnah, in its various categories, became the core document. And everything following the Mishnah is basically either commentary on the Mishnah or commentary on the Bible itself. And sometimes you get these very creative works that mix the two together so that they'll give you laws of the Mishnah and explain how the Mishnah is related to the Torah. But in this case, I want to start with a Mishnah. It's from the order of courts and torts, what we would call Nizikin. And it's a story that is told. And when I say story, I mean story, and I mean story like this is a rabbinic fantasy. I'm all but certain this story did not take place in historic reality. Rather, this is how a rabbi imagines an impressive pagan might confront a rabbinic leader. And I'll tell you why I believe what I believe as we read it. But let's start with the story itself. Charlie, is there a way you can blow that up even a little more so people like me can actually read? Yeah, there you go. Read the text. So it begins, the Mishnah begins by saying that Proculus, the son of Philosophus, asked a question of Rabban Gamliel. So let me introduce the characters. I'll start with the rabbi, Gamliel. Gamliel is the son of Shimon, who is the son of Gamliel I. So the first Gamliel we talked about, I think, last week, He was Gamliel, who lived at the time of Jesus and Paul. He lived in the 50s, 60s, 70s. His son Shimon became head of the Jewish community and had the misfortune of being the head of the Jewish community when the Jews rebelled against Rome in the year 66 to 70. After he was deposed and probably arrested, his son, Gamliel II, who we call Gamliel of Yavne, Gamliel became the leader of the Jewish community. And this pagan wants to ask a question of the very leader of the Jewish community. His name is Proculus, the son of Philosophus. Now, I read Greek literature fairly regularly. Most of you probably don't. But I hope you realize that a name, Philosophus, is pretty unlikely. Philosophus simply means the philosopher. And most people did not have that as a proper name. Truth be told, Proculus is not uncommon as a Greek name, but it also is related to the procurator. And I really think that some storyteller is making this up. He's making up a Greeky sounding name, like, let's pick a pagan out of the hats. Oh, I know, Proculus, the son of Philosophus. So he asks the following question of Gamliel, and they set the scene for us as well. This is taking place, let's say, around the year 100 of the Common Era. That's, what is it now, 2021? So it's 1900 years ago, give or take. Gamliel was bathing in the bathhouse of Aphrodite in Akko. So it says in Hebrew, it actually says it right there in the Hebrew. It's at the bottom of the page. Merchatz shel Aphrodite. And the town is Akko. If you've ever visited Israel, you know that Akko is quite far to the north in the Galilee. But why is the large public figure, Gamliel, in a public bathhouse? And the answer is because he wanted to bathe. In the late antique world, and this is hard for people to really understand, people did not have private plumbing. In order to have a bath in your home, you needed to have enough money to run an aqueduct from the mountains or from the city aqueduct to your private home. The only people who could do that were people who were fabulously wealthy. How fabulously wealthy? Wealthy enough that they could be the ones who paid for the aqueduct to bring water to the entire city. I don't know how many of you have been in Rome. I would ask for a show of hands and hope that many of you have been in Rome. And you might have noticed one of the features in the city of Rome is every few hundred yards, there is a little, almost like a stand, a fire stand, a fire hydrant, but it's not a fire hydrant. What it really is a water fountain. And it's a water fountain where water dribbles out all day long because it is an artifact of the public fountains that fed the populace of Rome since the first century. For 2,000 years, they brought water down from the mountains using aqueducts. Aqueducts, by the way, run on gravity. The water would flow down, it would come to the fountain, and out it would come so that people could fill up their buckets and schlep water into their house. Why did they want water in their house? Well, first of all, they needed it for their chamber pots. I say chamber pots to remind you, they didn't have flush toilets. They didn't have bathtubs. If they wanted to bathe, they went to the public baths. Even on occasion, the emperor of Rome would go to the public baths. So in a bath, they were quite sophisticated. The baths were, in fact, maybe one of the great signs of Hellenistic culture. A bath was fed, as I said, by an aqueduct. It was a public place. It usually had 3 different pools. One pool was called the frigidarium. The frigidarium, sounds like a Frigidaire, actually was a cold water pool. Most people just dunked in that very quickly for a very simple reason. It was cold. Then they went to what's called the tepidarium. You don't really need to know Latin or Greek to translate tepidarium. It had tepid water, and in fact, it was the equivalent of a swimming pool. And people quite literally would go there and do laps and get some exercise. And then finally, at the end, they would go to the caldarium. Caldarium, like scalding, it was the hot tub. The hot tub was small because they needed to heat it up. In fact, most hot tubs are small. Well, actually, I have to be careful. I'm talking to Californians in large measure. You have these, giant hot tubs. What do I know? But the thing that really fascinates me is most Roman hot tubs that have been excavated by archaeologists are almost exactly the same volume of water. And the volume of water is, in Hebrew volume, 40 se'ah, exactly the amount of water we would put in a mikvah. So it's clear that the Roman bath and the Jewish mikvah could trade off with one another. People would come to the baths. They would come mid-afternoon when the sun was bright and the water was warm, and they would spend an hour or two bathing. This was part of their afternoon siesta. They'd work in the morning, they would schwitz in the afternoon, and then they'd go back to work for a few more hours in the evening. In addition to having the various pools and locker rooms and places to dry off, you could play ball in the courtyard. The Tosefta in Tractate Shabbat actually talks about playing ball on Shabbat in an enclosed public bathhouse. Was it permissible or not? And the other thing that I find fascinating was they had a reading room. They would literally chain manuscripts to the wall so that people could stand around and read, but not take the book out and rip it off. They had to leave it there because it was chained to the wall. I'm also reminding you that this bath is what the Romans and Greeks would call a gymnasium. What is a gymnasium? It is a place where you are naked. Now, you may wonder, if people are naked in the baths, were they co-ed? And I will confess there was a very, very brief period that the Roman baths were co-ed. But the Romans were very fussy and fastidious people, and they had their sexual mores, just like Jews and Christians. So in large part, men bathed separate from women. Men bathed in the late morning and into the afternoon. Women got to bathe in the early morning and the late afternoon. It's not just that they wanted to give women two different times to bathe, but those of you who know the ways of the sun and the way the sun heats water, you will realize that the men of Rome have given the women the two worst hours to be in the water: in the morning when it's still very cold, and in the evening when it is maybe not so clean and already cooling down. So it was unquestionably a boys' club, and here they are in the bathhouse, and they call it the bathhouse of Aphrodite. As we will learn, it's probably called that because there is either a mosaic or a statue of the goddess Aphrodite. Our pagan Proculus asks a question from the Torah. Now, let me be clear about this. In this era, the Torah had already been translated into Greek. He could have read the Torah, but the odds of a pagan having read the Torah are near to zero. In other words, we're fantasizing that this pagan could read the Torah and then ask a question of Gamliel. Or let me put it another way. Gamliel, who seems quite entertained by art, seems to invite art that might look dangerous to Jews. So rather than confront him directly, they put their question to him in the mouth of an other, so that that outsider can say, Gamliel, new? What are you doing? You're in a bathhouse. There's a statue of a goddess, Pasnicht. For those of you that don't know Latin, Pasnicht means this is inappropriate. So thought I would just translate a little there. So he quotes, and he quotes from Deuteronomy. And the verse in Deuteronomy is, V'lo yidbak biyadcha uma min hacherem. Nothing that is prohibited should stick to your hand. In other words, he's saying, you know and I know that Aphrodite, here's a nice picture of her, the goddess Venus, Aphrodite in Greek, Venus in Latin. Shut your eyes and see Botticelli's Venus rising from the sea, right? That Venus is a goddess. How can you bathe in a bathhouse that has a statue of the goddess? So Gamliel seems to be well prepared for this question. And he puts the guy off brilliantly. He says, I'd love to answer your question, but you actually asked me a question of halacha, and I'm standing here naked. I can't answer. Wait until we get dressed. We'll go out of the bathhouse, and then we can talk Torah. So they go out, and now Gamliel, who was one down, is one up. He says, I didn't come onto her turf. She came to mine. From which I'm going to infer that Gamliel has been bathing at that bathhouse for a very long time. And one day, someone on the building committee decided, oh, let's put up a statue of Aphrodite. After all, my son-in-law is a statue maker. I can get a discount. So now suddenly Gamliel's bath has become Aphrodite's bath. He said, it wasn't the case that they said, let's build a bathhouse to honor Aphrodite. Actually, what they said is, let's put up a statue to make the bathhouse look nice. Now, we already have a principle that we're going to come back to, but Gamliel's not done. He really wants to embarrass the guy who asked the question. So he says, let me ask you another thing. If they said to you, Mr. Pagan, Mr. Son of Philosophus, that we'll give you all the money in the world, would you go to your pagan temple naked? Like, would you show up in shul on Rosh Hashanah without a tie? Maybe it's not the same question. Actually, at Park Avenue, it would be the same question. So he's making it clear, like, you have your decorum, we have our decorum. You wouldn't go into a temple naked. You wouldn't go into a temple impure, nor would you go into a temple and pee there. And yet, Aphrodite's standing here in the bathhouse where everybody's urinating in front of her. How can you think that this is worship of the goddess? And then he says his principle. He comes back to where he started. And this principle has become the standard principle of Jewish law and Jewish arts. Prohibition. And when he says the prohibition, he's talking about the second commandment of the Ten Commandments. When we read the Ten Commandments, we read a few weeks ago in Viat Hanan, the second commandment says, you shall make no graven images, none in the heaven above, none on the earth below, etc. He says, you're not allowed to make images of gods that are venerated as gods. In other words, if people were davening to Aphrodite, it would be prohibited. But sometimes art is art. And because of that, he's able to say that if it's not being venerated as a god, like the case of the bathhouse in Akko, where Aphrodite is just a nice statue, then it's totally permissible. As I said 2 weeks ago, when we looked at a variety of Roman art, one of the things we see, and it might be coincidence, because I'm not sure how much influence these rabbis really had. Charlie can attest to this painfully, that apparently sometimes Jews in synagogues do not pay absolute attention to their rabbis. It's just, that's the way it is. People do what they do, and I think that's especially true with the building committee. They're going to do what they're going to do. Thank you, Rabbi. We appreciate your opinion. We're voting now, right? That's what happens. So I think one of the things we see from the time of Gamliel, around the year 100, before Gamliel, virtually all the art we have, and that's all the remnants of the Temple Mount and all the first century synagogues that we have uncovered, and they are probably now in the dozens, all we have is geometric design. It's only after the time of Gamliel, from the year 100 onward, that we start to get pictorial art, that we start to get the kind of representational art that we saw 2 weeks ago, of biblical figures, taka, even figures of gods. We saw Zeus Helios on synagogue floors, and even figures of God of the Bible, reaching out from the heavens to talk to Abraham, etc. So this Mishnah from Tractate Avodah Zarah, a tractate that is dedicated to the laws of avoiding pagan worship, actually says that you do not have to avoid pagan images if they are art. There is a difference in aesthetic between art and worship. And while Gamliel, I'm sure, would admit that sometimes there's a gray area, this has been an incredibly powerful principle of our Jewish law since the first century. And so when I introduced our very, very first session, I said that particularly German Lutherans in the 19th century would refer with a sneer to Jews as artless people because we had the second commandment. All that indicated was they were utterly ignorant of Jewish art. And we have an ongoing tradition of Jewish art from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, from the time of Gamliel, unto this very day. Now, if this Mishnah mentions Aphrodite explicitly, we have another early narrative from our rabbis, and this second early narrative mentions Aphrodite by a nickname. So let's tell you the story, and I have to tell you, by way of background, this is what the earliest commentary we have on the Book of Numbers. It's Tannaitic. It means it probably dates from the 2nd century. The rabbi who's named, if it is authentically his, is indeed a 2nd century rabbi. And it's a great story about a rabbinical student and a lady of the evening, a prostitute, a pro. And I teach this to my rabbinical students, and they never know quite what to make of it. And I'll tell you why when we get there. So Rabbi Natan is in praise of the mitzvah of tzitzit. Now, many of you go to shul, you put on a tallis, and on your tallis, there's tzitzit. Some of you may, in the morning, when you get dressed, put on a talit katan, so that under your shirt, you have tzitzit as well. And the point of tzitzit, as the mitzvah is that you should see the tzitzit and remember the mitzvot. So Rabbi Natan, in praise, and by the way, this story is told precisely in the place in Numbers, in the commentary to Numbers, where the paragraph is about tzitzit. So you can find it right on the spot. Rabbi Natan sings the praises of tzitzit. He says, every commandment in the Torah has its reward. And we can learn this from the mitzvah of tzitzit. And here's the story. Once upon a time, there was a man, let's call him a rabbinical student, who was very careful in the mitzvah of tzitzit. He heard, we'll see how careful this guy was, that there was a prostitute in one of the harbor towns. Think Caesarea Maritima, big harbor town. And this woman charged 400 gold pieces as her price. Now, in the time of Rabbi Natan, 400 gold pieces would be like charging $10,000. This is real money. $10,000, Charlie will attest to this, $10,000, we would call that New York dinner and a movie, right? That's real money. So she was very expensive. And how he did it, I don't know. Maybe he tutored for bar mitzvah, he taught Hebrew school, but he saved up his money. And when he got his 400 gold pieces, he sent his little package to her and made an appointment for the big day. When the day came, he was very excited. And he came and he sat in her antechamber. She had a very fancy house. And there she had a maid who came out to check out the appointment. And the maid checks him out. And she goes into the prostitute. And she says, your John is here. This is a Hebrew story. She probably called him Yochanan, not John. But she said, he's here. And the prostitute says, let him enter. Now, like this is a boy coming from the farm or something, right? When he entered, he saw in front of him 7 beds of silver. And at the top of this tower of beds of silver, there was one of gold. And between every single bed, you could climb your way up, there was a safsal. For those of you who went to Camp Ramah, safsalim, you know, are benches. And you all think that's a beautiful Hebrew word until you stop and think about samach pei, samach lamed, too many letters. There's 4 letters, and we would like a 3-letter Hebrew root. And in fact, it's a loan word. The Greek and Latin term is subcellium. It's that what you put under your feet. It's a little bench. So there's a bench to climb from one bed to the other. At the very top of the ladder, at the top of the mountain, there is the prostitute arrayed in all her glory. You can imagine in your mind's eye, please, the rabbinical student climbing up the beds, stripping off his clothes, one thing after another, until the last thing he gets to is his talit katan. And as he pulls it over his head, his tzitzis whack him in the face. They give him a real frost. And he, of course, thinks this is not a coincidence, that God has reached out and given him a frost across the face. What are you doing? The Hebrew is lovely here. I translated it. He immediately disengaged and sat on the ground. The Hebrew is a little closer to saying he immediately deflated. We'll leave that aside. But this poor boy now, having invested 400 gold pieces, is no longer capable of doing what he paid to do. He's been unmanned by his seat. And the prostitute, she's never had this happen to her before. Her reputation's at stake. All of a sudden, some Jew boy comes in and he can't do what she's supposed to be the expert at getting him to do. So she climbs down from the top and sits next to the guy on the floor. He's sitting on the floor, surely mortified. And she says to him, agape shalromi, gapa shalromi. Now, agape is Greek and it means love with a capital L. So she's basically taking an oath on the love goddess of Rome. Who is the love goddess of Rome? Venus, Aphrodite. So she may as well be saying, by Aphrodite, by Venus, Gapa Shalromi, I'm not going to let you go until you tell me what's wrong with me. What flaw did you see? I've never had this happen. And he, the poor boy, wants to be forthcoming. So he, in turn, takes his vow. What does he say? He's a good frum yid. He's not going to take a vow on a Roman goddess. He says, ha, abodah, by the temple service. So we know at heart he's still a good Jewish boy. But he says, I've never seen a woman as beautiful. Never. But God commanded us a very simple mitzvah. And in that mitzvah, not once, but twice, it's written, Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am the Lord your God. Why is it written there twice? He asks like a good midrashist. The first time is to teach us that God will give us reward for performing the mitzvah. But the second time is to teach us that God will punish us if we break the mitzvot. She is so moved by this explanation that now she responds. And look at the vow she says. She says to him, it's right near the bottom of the screen, by the temple service. And as soon as she says that, she's no longer vowing by Venus. She's now vowing by the Beit HaMikdash. So she too is on her way to Judaizing. She says, I will not allow you to leave until you write down your name, your city, and the name of the Beit Midrash where you learn Torah. I have to say, it's at this point, and only at this point, that my rabbinical students say, I don't think this story happened. Up till now, they can believe everything, but they cannot wrap their minds around the possibility that the guy would write down, I went to JTS. My dean was Charlie Savanor. That they can't, no. Impossible. No one would ever be that stupid. So suddenly they realize they're in the realm of fantasy. Before that, they were fine. So indeed, because it's a fantasy, the rabbinical student writes down exactly what she wants, and then he gets the hell out of here. He must be so embarrassed. I'm sure he was planning to go back to the Beit Midrash and on the QT tell all of his friends how great a lover he was. And instead, he goes back and is rather quiet about it all. But she's not. She is, in fact, the hero of the story. She is the mover and shaker of the story. This is a story about her, not him. She takes all of her wealth and she divides it up. 1/3 of it she gives to the government. That's a polite way of saying she gave them a bribe. They probably made a lot of graft money out of protection for this prostitute, and now they were suddenly going to lose income. So she paid them off. Then she gives 1/3 of it to the poor. Now, this is astonishing. We are commanded by the Torah to give 1/10 of our wealth to the poor. She gives 1/3, so she's way beyond the pale. But the other thing which you don't realize is that in the Roman world, it was not, absolutely not pagan culture to support the poor. Jews did it and Christians did it. For us, it was a mitzvah. And the pagans just let the poor starve. They called them in Latin humiliores. They were the humiliated ones. We would just not even see them. They were invisible. So the fact that she's giving 1/3 of her wealth to the poor, again, tells us that this woman has a Yiddish neshama. And then the final 1/3 she takes with her to the Rabbinic Academy of Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Chia is the student, the #1 student of Yehuda Hanassi, the rabbi who edited the Mishnah. So she is coming to one of the great rabbis in the early 3rd century. And I always imagine somebody walking into JTS with, $10 million and saying, I'd like to endow a building. This does not happen very often. And you can only imagine the warm greeting she received when she came with all this money in hand. And she says, Rabbi, to Rabbi Chia, will you convert me? Chia is a little suspicious. Why is this beautiful, obviously not Jewish woman coming with all of this money wanting to convert? So he says to her, maybe you saw one of my students? And she admits, yes, she did. She actually hands him the piece of paper. Now the kid is indicted in his own handwriting. Right there it is. He's guilty. Now Chia calls in the student. So can you imagine how mortified the student is? The dean, the Rosh Yeshiva, calls this kid in and says, excuse me, do you know this hooker? What's the kid going to say? He's like, he must want to just fall through the floor. But listen to what Chia says. Listen to the compassion he has. He says, stand up and take what you contracted for. When you first sent her the money, it was forbidden. But now that she's converting, and presumably they'll get married and live happily ever after, she will be permitted to you. And then the editor of this Midrash has to comment. He's just so astonished by the story. He says, wow, if that's the commandment for tzitzit, for putting fringes on your garment in this world, in the world to come, who can even imagine? So I just love the story because it's, as it were, a dirty joke with a punchline even. But it's so much more than that, because I think it represents the rabbinic romance, the rabbinic attraction to Greco-Roman Hellenism. It tells us that there are things in the pagan world that are very desirable, that we lust for, that we find beautiful, that we find sexy. And it also tells us that these things can be yours, but only if you bring them into the Beit Midrash. Only if we achieve a marriage, if you will, between Hellenism and Rabbinic Judaism. Only then can you have what you yearn for, the beauty of the Hellenistic world, the art of the Hellenistic world, and maybe even on a good day, the women of the Hellenistic world. But the point here is very clear, that we imagine on one side the rabbinical student and on the other side the savvy and beautiful courtesan. And make no mistake about it, the rabbis are somewhat demeaning of the Hellenistic world by calling her a whore. On the other hand, they admit freely that Jews find this desirable, attractive, and they can bring, quite literally, great gifts into the Jewish community. And that really would be my reading of how first and second century Jews, literally in the midst of rebelling against Rome, let's remember, they rebelled against Rome 66 to 70, and there was a second rebellion, 132 to 135, although truth be told, the rabbis did not participate in that second rebellion, what we call the Bar Kokhba rebellion. But even so, the rabbis wanted to get along. They wanted to be part of the Hellenistic world. They wanted to integrate Greco-Roman culture so that we were no longer a biblical religion, no longer tied to an altar, which was destroyed, and instead become a very Hellenistic religion of the book that we could interpret, we could read, we could do rhetoric. And those gifts that we got from the Roman world would be the gifts that frankly have brought us to this very day. So I think now I would like to take a few minutes for some discussion, questions. I already see in the chat there are quite a number of questions. So Charlie, would you be good enough to be the concierge for all of this and call on people or read their questions or whatever the case may be?
Yes. First of all, I love that story, and I learned it many years ago, and I've never looked at my tzitzit exactly the same way. So I wanted to, actually, I have a question of my own, if I can, which is, I know that you do interfaith dialogue, and you go in, and I imagine in that work, I know from following you, you go into different prayer spaces. So has there been any interesting moments of, you know, going into either Islamic or Jewish or, Christian spaces where the art was a distraction from the sacred conversation you were trying to create?
So thank you, and I promise I did not plant this question with Charlie, but it's a perfect question. In Muslim prayer spaces nowadays, there will be no art. There will be maybe geometric design, but they are pretty aniconic. They don't do art. In churches, I have not been distracted from davening because I don't usually daven in a church. Although I have to say, I will admit this freely, many years ago, my wife, I went with her. I was a good husband. I went with her. She had a convention in Berlin. And on a Sunday morning, we got on the train very early, and we took an hour ride to the city of Leipzig. And from the train station in Leipzig, we were able to walk to the Thomaskirche, the Church of St. Thomas. We came in very respectfully. We sat in the back because we knew we were going to leave early. And at 9 o'clock, exactly to the second, they opened with a Bach prelude. And after the prelude, a Bach fugue. And the reason it was so moving to me, so spiritually moving, I might even say a religious experience, is because that was Bach's church. Not only did Bach play the organ in that church, by the way, his title at that church was cantor. That's the Latin term. He was the cantor. But he's buried in that church. So to hear Bach in Bach's church, that was a phenomenal moment. But I didn't consider it a negative moment. I considered it a positive moment. The one time I really was almost stymied was I was in a mosque in Virginia, in Northern Virginia. And the imam said to me, "Come, it's prayer time. It's time for the evening prayer." I went with him, and I was surprised because normally I would be asked to stand at the back and not with the Muslims who were about to pray. And my friend, Imam Majid, said, "Come, Bert, line up with us." And I said, Imam Majid, I can't kneel down and pray. You know that. He said, "No, but when we stand, you stand." He said, "And I know, you know how we're going to start." And sure enough, as with all Muslim prayer, they start with the first chapter of the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbi al-Alamin, ar-Rahman, etc. So as it were, I davened with them. When they kneeled down, I stayed standing. I was feeling a little conspicuous, I confess. And what I didn't know was their custom was to actually kneel for quite a good bit of time. And I realized fairly quickly on that while they were kneeling, I could recite Ashrei. So I said Ashrei. They came up, they finished their prayer, and I felt really very loved because the Muslim community considered me, as it were, one of their own. The truth is, if we believe what we say, which is that Christianity and Islam are both monotheistic religions, then the reality is we all pray to the one only God. So we're praying to the same God. We have different customs. We have different ways of praying, although frankly, that's true in the Jewish community, even within the community. So I'm willing to give my colleagues the benefit of the doubt. I may not pray the same way they do, but I do believe I pray to the same God they do.
Sorry about that. We just got a thing for a flash flood in our area. Sorry about that, that interruption.
In our area?
Meaning on the East Coast. So we'll be careful that we don't go outside after the session.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we got a great question here about the last statement you made about how the Jews related to Greek culture or to the Hellenistic culture. The question here was, at one point wasn't clear about how it played out in reality. Did you mean that it only played out in the diaspora, or was it even when the temple stood and Jews and Romans and Greeks were living together in a community? And the question is, can you give us a little bit more detail in terms of the divisiveness and the inclusion between the Hellenistic culture and Jewish culture?
So first of all, I want to say, it's a little bit self-promoting, but a lot of this is in much more detail than I can do now in the book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis. I really try and deal with these issues. The Jews were of Hellenistic culture. They lived in almost smack in the middle of the Roman world. It went as far east as to the border of India, as far west as to England. So Eretz Yisrael is right in the middle. In terms of archaeology, there's not an enormous amount different between the archaeology of the synagogues in Eretz Yisrael and those of the diaspora. In other words, Jews were Jews. They had a love-hate relationship. By and large, they adopted Hellenistic culture where they could. Even the Beit HaMikdash was not that different in its structure than pagan temples. My teacher, Professor Lieberman, has written kind of startlingly about aspects of the Beit HaMikdash that are found in any pagan temple throughout the Roman world. So a Roman going in would be not only familiar with the structure and the priesthood, but the Roman would also know that at a certain point, they could go no further in because they were not of the right religion. And that was true in pagan religion too. We always think of pagans as great polytheists, and as polytheists, they were very tolerant of everyone. And to an extent, that's true. But they were only tolerant of you if you would also worship the God they were worshiping. And if you worshiped a different God or chose not to worship their God, then you had declared yourself an outsider. And like the Beit HaMikdash, there was literally a sign that said, "Come no further." By the way, we have discovered that sign in the Beit HaMikdash. It's not just that the Mishnah says there was a sign, we now have it. And it's in Latin, it's in Greek, and it's in Hebrew. And let's hear it for the archaeologists who can find material from the Second Temple. It's an extraordinary thing.
The love-hate relationship, And maybe, I mean, I think the question I'm about to ask, we might need a much larger, like, it seems the places that you lean into where Judaism and Roman culture interacted well, it seemed like there was an opening for Judaism to not just for Jews to spread geographically, but for Jewish ideas maybe to take root in the Roman world. What do we have hints of disappointment that Judaism didn't become the religion of the Roman Empire, but rather it was Christianity?
Well, let's also remember that Christianity is a daughter of Judaism. That for pagans, Christianity was in a way a form of Judaism. So when they adopted Christianity, they were adopting what they thought was in some real part Jewish practice. And the church kept many of the trappings, even of the Second Temple, so that pagans could be comfortable with this Jewish cultic notion. And it's ironic, of course, because the church didn't do animal sacrifice and the Jews stopped doing animal sacrifice. And yet we maintained the lip service to it and the trappings of it outside of actually killing the animals. And that made pagans pretty comfortable because they also had animal sacrifice. So there are a lot of remnants in Judaism and Christianity. And this is not a class or a lecture on the relations of early Judaism to early Christianity. That's a whole nother series for another time. And it's a series that I've taught more than once in Vatican universities. But the reality is that the pagan world imbibed a great deal of Judaism. So it was a two-way street.
Was there in terms of culture, right? Because we talk about the Hellenistic culture, but with what in terms of how Jews intersected or interacted, was there a difference between the Greek culture and the Roman culture? The Greek
So
church,
yeah,
or whatever you want to call it, in the Roman
yes
one?
and no. So Greeks were more to the east, Romans were more to the west. Romans were Latin speakers, Greeks were Greek speakers. But the truth is that the Roman Empire, when it conquered the Greek Empire, when the Roman Empire conquered the Greeks, what they didn't know is they almost utterly adopted Greek culture. So from the inside, the reality was that the Greeks maybe didn't have a stronger army, but they had a stronger culture, so that Romans played out a great deal, an enormous amount of Greek culture, which is why I've been careful to talk about it as Hellenistic culture. Hellene means Greek, or Greco-Roman culture, because ultimately they became one and the same. And I would go so far as to say that Rabbinic Judaism is an Eastern manifestation, a monotheistic manifestation of Greco-Roman culture.
Can you go a little deeper with what you just said right there?
Yes. So I'm looking at the screen, and I know there are Jews from the East Coast and the West Coast. And I know that many of you Jews know that East Coast Judaism and West Coast Judaism often have subtly different manifestations. That said, none of us will mistake Judaism for Christianity. On the other hand, every one of us, please God, is pretty comfortable in this Christian country. And we know it's a Christian country, and we know it's an exceptional country because by and large, not always, but by and large, we have freedom to be the Jews we want to be. But we're pretty comfortable. Look at our clothing. I mean, just look at the screen. We look at the screen and maybe we think, oh, such Yiddish upon him. But how do we look different than another screen full of Americans? Not so much. Not so much with the background, not so much with our furniture, not so much with our Zoom, except maybe Cliff Cornell's picture there. I think that we are fairly comfortable, and the way we are comfortable is the way they were comfortable. It may not be a perfect analogy, but one of the things I like and one of the things that attracts me in Rabbinic Judaism is that it is a Judaism that we can comfortably own as American Jews, because it's all about living within the broader culture.
Fantastic. Just in terms of geography, we had a question about whether the stories that we read tonight were from the Rishalmi or the Bavli. I think they actually weren't from the Talmud itself.
No, actually, they're found in the Talmud, but the sources I brought you are all from sources in the land of Israel. The Mishnah and the Sifrei Bamidbar in the land of Israel, somewhere around the year 200. So they're in Roman Palestine, which, by the way, answers a question that somebody asked on the chat. When did the term Apicorus start to mean a heretic? And the answer is in the Bavli. In the Babylonian Talmud, where they did not know Greek and they didn't know who Apicorus was, they could, from the context, guess that an Apicorus was somebody who disagreed with the rabbis. And ultimately, it came to mean someone who disagreed with the rabbis, that is to say, a heretic. Barbara Kessel is asking, Haggadah? And that's the next lecture. So let me just give you a little taste. And that little taste is going to have to suffice as a tease. This is my way of inviting myself back for another lecture. I hope you'll all tell Ari, you got to get Bert to come before Pesach. We need to hear this lecture so we have good material for our Seder. But I'm going to argue that the Passover Seder, as we now have it, I don't think anybody on any of the screens actually slaughters a Paschal lamb. We don't do that. But we have this order of the Seder. And that order, literally, the Seder of the Seder, is the structure of a Greco-Roman symposium. The Hellenistic symposium starts as early as Plato's symposium and goes all the way to probably the year 500 of the Common Era. So it had almost a 850-year run of symposial literature. And just to give you a quick idea of the extent to which we have a Seder like a symposium, the simplest thing I'll tell you is that for our hors d'oeuvres at the Seder, what do we dip? What's it called?
To the karpas.
Karpas. But karpas is not a Hebrew word.
No.
Karpas is a Greek word. And it's not just any Greek word. It functions exactly the same as the Hebrew word pri. When we say borei pri ha'etz or borei pri ha'adama or borei pri ha'gafen, we have to qualify the word pri because it could be a fruit or a vegetable. And in Greek, it's the same thing. Karpos means a fruit or a vegetable. So when the rabbis say you take the karpos and dip it, they're winking at you. They're letting you know that we're borrowing a Greek term because, in fact, we're borrowing a Greek structure so that we can continue to celebrate Passover without offering a Paschal lamb any longer. And we're turning it into a symposium. A symposium is a place where you discuss literature and you link the literature to the food. You ask questions like, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. But as I said, that's another lecture.
Well, I want to thank you for a wonderful program tonight. I mean, this was really eye-opening and generated. I think it's always good to be one of these programs and leave with more questions and answers. I know on behalf of the participants here, we will ask for you to come back. I think we have a lot more to learn, and I know from my own experience that learning with you is a real treat. And I hope that CSP can experience more of you, Professor Visotzky. I want to thank.
I would love that. And by the way, God willing, I would love it so that we could all be there together in person.
Amen. And also, I want to thank you. No one has ever compared me to the Archbishop before. So that was a first. That was like a Shechianu moment for me. And I really appreciate that. So I want to thank everyone for being here. We look forward to seeing everyone at CSP real soon again. We've got some great programming coming up this week. And I know that Ari will follow up this session with the handout and some other links. And someone just put, David and Susan Phillip, just put into the chat that Ari would be the Pope. I have to give some thought to that. If he does, I'm sure there'll be smoke. I don't know where it's coming from. There'll be smoke out of the chimney.
And can I just have one last word and wish everybody a healthy and happy new year. That's really what we want for all of us. Thank you.
Amen, amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing everybody really soon. All right, take care.
Shana Tova.
All right, Shana Tova, everybody.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Great to see everyone. Take care. Wow, Yasher Koach, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, see you all soon. Have a great night. Be safe out there. All right, take care. Good night.